Hello, and welcome to today's European SharePoint, Office 365 and Azure Community webinar. My name is Laura, and I'm delighted to be joined by Nico Jacobs from U2U in Belgium, who will present the topic Data Governance with Microsoft Purview. Remember to join in on the conversation about today's webinar and more on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @EuropeanSP, and our hashtag is #ESPC23. Don't forget to check out the Resource Centre. This is updated daily with the latest blogs, ebooks, webinars, and how-to videos. Simply visit sharepointeurope.com and click the Content tab at the top. Continue your learning by joining us for our next webinar, PNP PowerShell, What You Need to Know, which takes place Tuesday, February 21st from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. CET. For full details, please check out sharepointeurope.com/register for webinars. Last November, over 2,000 SharePoint, Office 365, and Azure professionals joined us in Copenhagen for ESPC 22. We now have an amazing showreel video full of ESPC 22 highlights. Visit sharepointeurope.com to watch this brief recap of all the learning, development, networking, and fun that was had over this amazing 4-day event. The European Power Platform Conference Super Early Bird Sale is now on. Join us this June 20th to 22nd in Dublin, Ireland, for the second European Power Platform Conference. Experience up to 3 unrivaled days of in-person learning, sharing, and networking. Make sure to visit sharepointeurope.com to avail of this offer. The ESPC 23 call for speakers is now officially open. Be part of something truly special. Speak and engage with leading experts, IT professionals, developers, and business decision makers at ESPC 23, Europe's premier Microsoft 365 and Azure conference. This is your chance to take a leading role within the conference and the community, sharing your in-depth knowledge, passion, and experience with your peers, in turn helping empower the Microsoft 365 and Azure community to professional success. Please visit sharepointeurope.com/submit-speak-ESPC to find out more. After the webinar, we will have a questions and answers session. Type any questions you might have into the questions window. Questions will be selected and answered at the end of the presentation. This webinar will be recorded and added to the Resource Centre, where you will be notified by email when it is available. And now I'm going to pass you over to our webinar presenter today, Nico. Hello, Nico.
Good morning, and thanks for the introduction. So my name is Nico Jacobs. I work as a trainer at U2U, a training company, and I started here as the database guy. It's a SQL Server, but that's been a while. I already work here for now 19 years. And of course, over time, the data landscape has evolved. Lots of things got more into the world of Power BI. So that's one of the things on which I'm spending quite a bit of time, but also the cloud became more and more important. So more and more companies were moving their data into Azure SQL databases in the cloud, or now the data lake, and the data lakehouse world is getting more and more important. So I'm running a bunch of trainings on that as well. But because of that, more and more companies have now the problem that they have data everywhere. They're more or less drowning in their data. Where is all my data? And luckily, Microsoft introduced a product on that one called Purview. But before I go into that one, let's first briefly tell you a little bit about the country where I live. I'm from Belgium, and maybe those of you already flown into Belgium might have noticed that we have 2 airports called Brussels. We have Brussels Airport and we have Brussels South. But Brussels South is really, from a Belgian point of view at least, quite far from Brussels itself. So it's 2 names, 2 very similar names, but for different things. And the reason why I mention this is because we have a bit of a similar problem, if you want to call it like that, with the term Microsoft Purview. Microsoft rebranded their products, and now Microsoft Purview is a name that covers 2 quite different things. On one hand, you have all the governance story in the Office stack, that is nowadays labeled Microsoft Purview. And on the other hand, we have the governance story in the Azure stack, which is also called Microsoft Purview. So I first want to warn you, this talk is about the product that was called Azure Purview and the Azure-oriented version of the story. I'm not going to talk about the Office 365 part of the story, which has different portals and different settings. Okay, so what are we going to do? First, a little bit about why. Why would we need something like Microsoft Purview? Why do we need a metadata catalog? Because in the long run, that's mainly what it is. But then we will very quickly shift into the how question. So this Microsoft Purview, how do I get started with this product? Comparing it a little bit to Azure Data Catalog, because you can see Purview as Azure Data Catalog version 2, but they decided to give it a new name. And then we'll jump into this portal, because that's the platform with which you can go ahead and not only create, but also query all the objects that you're creating in there. One of the important things of a metadata repository, of course, is to get metadata in there. We'll see that that is mainly done by running a scan on all the resources, but first the system needs to know where the resources come from. We'll talk a little bit about glossaries and other types of metadata that can be stored inside Purview. And if we have enough time, we can also talk a little bit about the fact that it's not only a portal where you have to go ahead and work with these things the way Microsoft dictates, it also has an API, which means that you can go ahead and integrate it in your own solutions, or can go ahead and program other things on this. And then at the very end, a little bit about things that have been recently announced on Purview, things that are in preview, and that will, of course, get more attention in the next couple of months. So let's first start with the need for a metadata catalog. So more and more companies, since data is the new gold, and we want to have a lot of gold, of course. So a lot of companies have more and more data assets on premises, because they still might have their local SQL Server or Oracle or whatever relational databases. Of course, there are a ton of files in companies, Excel sheets with important information, Access databases, etc. But of course, a lot of data lives in the cloud, and some companies don't stick with one cloud. They even sometimes go multi-cloud. They have certain things in Azure, other things are stored in Amazon or Google repositories. And then questions come along like, hey, GDPR, the right to be forgotten. A customer wants to be forgotten. Where is this customer information being stored? It's typically stored in a lot of different places, and we need to go ahead and find out what these places are. Or, for instance, you have a data scientist who arrives in the company and wants to start analyzing the data. Hey, where's customer information? Oh, yeah, it's spread all over the place. So can you go ahead and tell me where it lives? Or another problem that I sometimes hear is that people say, yeah, we have 45 Azure SQL databases, and we don't think we all need them anymore, but we don't really know which ones we can turn off, because we lost track what database was made for which project or for which tool, or that makes things more and more challenging. So it would be nice if we could go ahead and get a better idea on the kind of data that we have stored inside the company. Not only like, oh, we have a database over there and it's for that project, but who's responsible for this? Who pays the bill for these things? Is there an expire date when we can go ahead and clean up these things? So all sorts of metadata that can be added on top of the data itself. So in the past, there was already a solution for that, in the sense that a bunch of tools have their own metadata management. I'm a SQL Server guy, so in SQL Server, for instance, we have extended properties where we can label every table, every view, every store procedure in my database with whatever kind of metadata I want. Who's responsible, for which project is this, etc., etc. And a lot of different yeah, data storage solutions have something similar, but of course, there is no consistency amongst them. They all do it in a different way. And some of them, like plain vanilla file shares, etc., don't have this kind of metadata being stored in there. So that's more or less the need that we have. We want to have a central service that can go ahead and in a consistent way store this kind of metadata for both on-premises as well as cloud-based data. And that's what Purview brings to us. So it's a data governance service. Its basic job is to reach out and see which files you have, which tables you have in your databases, which Power BI data sets that you have, etc. And then it can go ahead and retrieve all this metadata, store it in a central way. But on top of that, it also allows you to go ahead and do further enrichment on top. So it automatically scans your data and discovers things like column names and data types for columns, etc. But it also gives us the opportunity to annotate all these things. For instance, specify who's responsible for this, or who's the domain expert who knows more about that particular data set. As we will see in a few minutes, there is a rich set of metadata that can be provided. When it comes to classification, the system has not only the option to go ahead and read, like, hey, this column name is called customer email address, so it's probably an email address. It can also recognize certain pieces of information. It can recognize, for instance, a credit card number, an email address, or a column where you have a lot of dates that are probably birthdays of people, etc. So it has a whole bunch of, rules built in that can help you to put labels on your data on top of just things like the column name. And not only does it have a bunch of built-in classification rules, we can go ahead and even extend those. So if, for instance, my company has invoice numbers that are made up in a certain way, I can go ahead and tell Purview about this, and then it can go ahead and recognize this pattern so that independent of the column name, it can still label things as, for instance, a UTU invoice. There's also support for glossaries. A challenge that you have in most companies is that sometimes people use different names for the same thing. Something is a product in one department, but it's called an item in another department, or we have a client in one department, but we call it a customer in the other department. So if you want to make sure that your BI works, then you have to make sure you have common terminology. So a business glossary can help you to build, so to speak, a dictionary of the key terms that you use inside your company. So there's glossary support, and we can enter glossary items. We can label things as matching to certain glossary items in there. Another interesting thing, and then I have more think about the people that, for instance, data engineers who need to go ahead and push data into all these systems. A problem that you often bump into is, I have data, for instance, in this table in SQL Server, but where does the data come from? Which kind of ETL tool is pushing the data in there? For instance, if you're using Synapse Analytics, you can go ahead and have pipelines who push data in there, or we have Azure Data Factory, which has similar pipelines, or maybe you used simply a store procedure inside your SQL Server who's pushing data in there. So Purview can go ahead and scan not all, but a subset of the possible ways to push data into, for instance, tables, and can go ahead and show you that information, such that you can see, like, oh, this Power BI report got its data through that, from that particular data set, who got its data from, let's say, this particular file in my blob storage account. So you can track the lineage of where your data comes from. So for all of this, we have a web portal that I'll show you in a few minutes, where we can go ahead and control, set up, and query all of these things. But as I already mentioned, there's also an API, such that if you want to do custom development on top of it, integrate it with your own solutions, or have PowerShell scripts to automate certain things, that's possible as well. Okay, so if we want to get started with this Purview product, we typically, first we need to set up a Purview account, but that's pretty straightforward. But as soon as we've made in Azure a Purview account, then the next steps is to first register the sources. Purview, of course, does not know what it should index. So we must first tell him about the blob storage accounts that we have, or the Azure Data Lakes that we made, or the on-premises FTP server or file share, or on-premises SQL Server databases that we have. So we need to provide pointers to where the data lives. That's known as registering the sources. And maybe as a small company, you might have 5 or 10 sources, but if companies grow, the list of sources can grow enormously. So maybe you have thousands of sources altogether in your company. So we'll see when we register these sources, it's sometimes needed to organize them a little bit in a structure. Okay, once we have the sources, we can tell the system to fetch the metadata. And this is known as scanning. You can do this on demand, or you can go ahead and put up a schedule like weekly or monthly. And then the system the first time, of course, has to read all the metadata, but the next time it can go ahead and just read the new files, or for instance, the newly made tables. Once we have fetched this base metadata, which will be things like table names and column names and data types, then we can start enriching this data. Because the system, of course, does not know who's responsible for a SQL Server table or for a file in a data lake. So it's our job to go ahead and put extra information on top of this, link it with glossary terms, or specify who's a domain expert on these things, etc. And once all of this has been done, then people can start to query this catalog, either via the portal. But as we will see as well, Purview integrates with other Azure products, such that, for instance, data engineers who are developing a new pipeline to ingest data can go ahead and query the catalog to more quickly develop their solutions. So this is also more or less the table of content for the talk. So first, look a little bit into registering sources, see how we can set up a scan, see how we can go ahead and enrich the data, and then go ahead and query the data. Very briefly, if there are people who already heard of or worked with Azure Data Catalog, this thing is, so to speak, Azure Data Catalog version 2.0. So the base Azure Data Catalog already exists for many, many years, but it had a couple of limitations. One limitation was you could only have one Azure Data Catalog per subscription. Now, there was a reason on this, of course. You don't want to create a Purview account for every separate team. The key goal of having a metadata repository is that you have nearly all the company metadata in one spot. You get so much more information from it if you can bring everything together. That doesn't mean that everybody is allowed to see everything. As we will see, we can put security in place such that you cannot see everything in the Azure Data Catalog. But at least you want to make sure that the people who really have permissions on this can see all the metadata at one spot. But of course, one instance per subscription is limiting you a little bit if you want to have, for instance, a dev test production setup. So if you want to have different tiers, then it could be handy to have more than one. So currently, we can have 3 Purview accounts per subscription per region, and that's already better than what we had with the data catalog. Another frustrating thing with the data catalog was it could not automatically reach out to your data and fetch the metadata. We always had to push data in there. With Purview, we have the choice. As we will see, we have the scanning, which automatically fetches the metadata. But if we really want, we can also write code to push the metadata in there ourselves. So multi-instance, automated scans, and much better integration with Azure Synapse, with Azure Data Factories, with Power BI, and what Azure Data Catalog. Okay, so first thing that we had to do is we had to go ahead and register the sources, because Purview needs to reach out to these sources and fetch the metadata from there. And in order to do so, we need to go ahead and tell him what the potential sources could be. So we have this web portal, and in this web portal, an important piece of information is the data map. Because in the data map, under the sources tab, we can start registering the sources. And there are a whole bunch of sources that are supported. Those of you familiar with, for instance, data factories or with pipelines in Synapse Analytics might recognize the look and feel of this thing. So the sources that we have over here are a subset of the sources that you have available in these pipeline technologies that I talked about. So there are cloud-based things, of course, the Microsoft Cloud, like you can read from a data lake, you can read from Cosmos DB, from Azure Data Explorer, from Azure SQL databases. But there is also support, for instance, to connect to Amazon Cloud, to connect to Power BI, but also to talk to on-premises data. Now, of course, if I want to talk to on-premises data, we need some extra software because the cloud cannot just penetrate your firewall and start talking to, for instance, an on-premises SQL server. So if you want to go ahead and index the metadata for on-premises data, an extra step is required. Then we need to have a self-hosted integration runtime, a little bit like the gateway some of you might be familiar with in Power BI. Finally, there's also a list of services that is supported. This list is not super long. It's not as advanced as it is in the data factories, for instance, but it's growing. This product evolves over time. So for instance, if I would say, hey, I want to read from a blob storage account, then of course you need to tell the system which blob storage account that is. Either it's from your current subscription and then you can just nicely choose it from a drop-down box, or you can go ahead and say, no, it's from another subscription, and you need to go ahead and provide this information. Now, the problem that we would have with this is if you have not 2 or 3 sources, but you have hundreds of sources, and you would have them just in one flat list, that becomes challenging to deal with. Challenging to find back your stuff, just like we organize files in folders to make it easy on us, we can also organize our sources in what we call collections. So out of the box, you have one root collection, and underneath that root collection, we can go ahead and create additional collections. But these collections also form a hierarchy for permissions. If you have, for instance, if we take a look at the hierarchy you see on screen over here, if I would have a certain permission on the root collection over here, I automatically have that permission on every item underneath. For instance, if I can check the scanned data on this one, on the Purview root collection over here, I can also check it in Europe and in the private set within Europe, etc. So when you set up your list of collections, try to think in terms of permissions. Who can see what? And if a certain set of data sources can be visited by a specific group, go ahead and make a specific collection for it, and then make use of the inheritance mechanism to make it easier to set up the permissions. Besides that, you can go ahead and build a whole bunch of collections over here, and in each and every of these collections, you see that icon over here. That's the icon to register your sources. So in this example over here, we see that the root collection has one source registered underneath it, an Azure Blob Storage, and under the private collection, we see an Azure SQL database that's registered under that. But every collection can have multiple sources registered underneath it. Okay, another important concept that we need to explain before we carry on is the concept of a resource set. Those of you familiar with data lakes might already have noticed that if you're working with large volumes of data, we don't want to squeeze everything in a single file. Because if you, let's say, would store hundreds of gigabytes of data in a single file, then often you cannot use parallelism to process the data. And of course, if we want to get performance, parallelism is key. So that's why in the data lake world, we typically split tables, etc., over multiple files. So we tend to create hundreds or maybe even thousands of files that all have similar data. They simply have, for instance, rows for different months. Let's say per month or per day, you create an additional file, and then all these files together make up your table, your logical table. So Purview recognizes this and will not tell you like, hey, I found 10,000 files over here, but it will treat the 10,000 files as one item called a resource set. So it, for instance, will tell you, hey, I found a sales resource set, and that resource set then maybe consists out of many, many files. So it has a lot of patterns that it can recognize. For instance, if you would have a bunch of files, but you'd simply have different numbers like checkout file 1, checkout file 2, etc., or you have grids in there, or you have a date structure like sales data, and then you have the year, and then in a subfolder the month, and in the subfolder the day, etc. The system can recognize these kind of patterns, and that way determine that they're all files that belong to the same logical table, to the same resource set. All these resource sets, it then does clever stuff, like for instance, trying to be more performant, not reading each and every file, because as we will see, you have to pay per minute that a scan takes. So the resources that we consume, we have to pay for. So if the system can skip reading certain files because it knows it has the same metadata as similar files, that might speed up things. Okay, maybe already do a quick demo on this part. So let's switch over to my portal. So here in my portal, in my Azure portal, I already made a Purview account. Creating one is very straightforward. But if you open up your Purview account, in the Purview account, you have one super important link. That's this one. Open the Microsoft Purview governance portal. So if you click that link, that takes you to another web page. And in that page, that's where we go ahead and do all the configuration. So out of the box, this Purview account is empty. If you would then go to your data map, you would see that the only collection that you have is a root collection. So if you go to collections, only that root collection is being made in there. But underneath that root collection, we can start creating sub-collections. My advice is always make one next sub-level collection over there. You never know that later on there will be an acquisition with another company or whatever, and you want to have, for instance, two sister companies right next to one another in this thing. So don't really use the root collection that is being made, except for registering your own root that you have for your company. But then in there, we can start creating sub-collections. So at each and every level, if you add a new collection, you just give it a name, for instance, a demo collection over here. But there you already see every collection has an administrator that has full permissions on top of this thing. But if you take it a step further, on every collection, we have a whole bunch of predefined roles. So this is the security story. For instance, there are roles like admins who can do whatever they want, or data source admins who can do on the data source what they want. Data curators, these are the people that can go ahead and, for instance, edit the metadata that we have on top of that. Or we just have data readers who can only read the data and cannot modify the metadata, etc. So you have a lot of roles in there, and these roles hold for a collection and all descendants of that collection, all children and grandchildren, etc. So that's why you have to think in terms of these collections from a security point of view. Okay, so once we have made a collection, in these collections, we can go ahead and start registering our sources. So for that, we go to the Sources tab. So for instance, in my demo collection that I made over here, we have that register button. And by clicking that register button, we can choose from the long list of supported sources. And for each and every one of them, for instance, if I want to read from a SQL database, we just need to go ahead and choose, for instance, in which subscription does this database live, which server is it, and then we can go ahead and register it. Okay. Notice that at this level, we don't yet need to provide authentication information. I don't need to tell the system how to authenticate to that database, for instance. So that's registering the different sources that we have. Okay, what we can do as well is we can tell the system, hey, we're using ETL tools or ELT tools, such as pipelines in Synapse or data factories, and we want to see that metadata as well. To do this, we can again go into our portal, and in the Purview portal, you have a management tab. And that management tab allows you to integrate your environment with, for instance, a data factory. So if you were using data factory, you can go ahead and say, oh, I have a data factory in my subscription, and I want to get all the data from that one. Now, if you're using Synapse Analytics, it's on the reverse. There, you don't go into Purview and point to the Synapse Analytics. It's the other way around. You go to your Synapse Analytics environment, and if you go to the Manage tab in that one, there you can set up a link to a Purview subscription that you have. In my case, I already set up the link. It's pretty straightforward, just choosing it from a drop-down box. And from now on, there is two-way communication between these two services. On one hand, if I would be building a pipeline here in my Synapse environment to ingest data, and I would run these pipelines, they send their lineage information into your Purview account. So then Purview knows, like, oh, this copy activity was reading from this source and writing to that destination over there. But the other way around, my Synapse over here can also go ahead and query the data that I have in Purview. Now, we haven't done a scan yet, so if you haven't scanned your data, then there is no metadata yet inside Purview, but on this subscription I already ran scans before. So here, if I would be a developer, for instance, inside these pipelines, and I want to develop a new copy activity, then I need to specify where does the data come from, and I might go like, yeah, I need customer information, but I don't really know where the customer information is stored, so I'll go to this search box. And in the search box, we can search Purview from within this Synapse environment. So here I can go ahead and say, oh, I'm searching for customer information. And then the system says, oh yeah, customer. Well, we have customer information here. We have customer information there. We have it in a database. We have it in a storage account. And then the user can click upon this, get more information about it. That's the querying of the Purview repository. And if the user is happy with this, if it goes like, yeah, that's exactly what I wanted, they can go ahead and, for instance, ask the system to create a data flow for this, or to go ahead and create integration data sets or linked services. If you're not into Synapse, don't worry about that, but Synapse developers will appreciate this kind of functionality because it makes it a lot easier to develop their pipelines. So in short, as soon as you set up the connection between Synapse and Purview, you have a two-way communication. Lineage information goes from the pipelines into Purview, and all the metadata querying goes from Purview into the Synapse. Okay, so that's what I showed you, how we can go ahead and do the registration. But once again, registration is just a pointer to a server or a pointer to a storage account. We don't yet know which files are in there. So that's the next step. That's called scanning. So if we set up a scan, we tell the system to read the data. We can do that on demand. If we just want to do that from time to time when we know that we introduced new tables or that we introduced new objects in my data lake, or we can schedule it to run it, for instance, weekly. The first time that you scan a resource, you do a full scan and it reads everything. The next time you can do incremental scans where the system remembers the kind of files it has already seen and, for instance, just reads newer files. If your data lives on premises, as already mentioned before, we need to go ahead and install some special software because Purview can, of course, not talk to things inside private network. So we have to install a sort of gateway, which is known as a self-hosted integration runtime. We're not going to cover that in this brief introduction. But if we set up a scan, we can also choose what we want to scan. If you scan a database, of course, yeah, then you're reading the tables and the views in there, then you have not much of a choice. But if you are reading, for instance, a storage account, yeah, you can have a bunch of files in there. And we can choose which files we're interested in. So we can, for instance, scan for Office files, like Word, PowerPoint files, etc. But we can also choose to read from structured files, like XML files or CSV files, or files like Parquet, which are more popular in the big data world. Okay, so to set up such a scan, I'll just switch into a demo mode. Then you can go ahead and see how to do this. So let's go back to my Purview. In my Purview, we go to the data map. And I, for instance, want to go ahead and scan some resource that I have registered in here. On every resource, you have this, this symbol that looks a little bit like Pac-Man. And if you click that one, that's the thing with which we can choose to scan. So if we scan, the system already knows, for instance, this is a scan on a SQL server. So it already knows what server, that's what we specified when we registered the source, but it does not know yet which database, for instance. So you have to go ahead and choose the database you want to scan. Or we have to go ahead and set up credentials. How can the Purview account start talking to that database? Out of the box, your database does not allow queries from Purview. So you have to set up credentials. And this can be done in a lot of ways. For every source, the manual explains how to set up these credentials. So in my case, for instance, I already gave my Purview account, my Azure, the Azure account that is associated with the Purview service, I gave that one permissions to query the relational database. You can go ahead and test whether those permissions are set up correctly. If that is okay, then you can continue and do the scan. So if you're scanning a database, you can just choose which tables you want to scan, and by default, you're scanning all of the tables in there. But if you do a scan on a file, then there is another set of questions. That is, which folders do you want to scan, and which file types do you want to scan inside them? But then another question comes along, the scan rule set. What is a scan rule set? Well, I already mentioned in the introduction that Purview has a whole bunch of pre-programmed patterns it can detect, such as credit card numbers, driver license numbers, etc. And in these scan rule sets over here, we can go ahead and see the rules that he's searching for. So over here is searching for Argentina national identity numbers, etc. If you're not happy with that, if you want to tell the system, hey, I'm only interested, for instance, in Belgian driver license numbers and Belgium national numbers, passport numbers, then you can go ahead and restrict yourself to that kind of metadata. Because the fewer patterns it has to search for, the more quickly it can scan, and the cheaper the run would be. So if you're not happy with this, you can create your own rule sets. And in your own rule sets, we can then choose from all these predefined patterns in there, the ones we're interested in. So in my case, for instance, I could say, oh, only search for Belgian driver license numbers, passport numbers, etc. Again, there's a long list of these things, also financial information like credit card numbers, personal information like email addresses, etc. for GDPR stuff that can be interesting, security things like common passwords, etc. Whole bunch of pre-programmed rules. And if you're not happy with the list of rules, I don't have enough time to show you that one, but you can go ahead and set up your own classification rules. So you can add extra patterns to this if you're interested. Okay, so in that way, we would be able to go ahead and set up our own set of rules, and then the system can just go ahead and start doing the scan. So in my case, on that database, with all the tables that we have in there, with the default scan rule set, you can now just scan it once or scan it on all sorts of schedules. So you have lots of options in there, like scan this on the last day of the month, etc. Okay, so once you let this thing do its scanning. As soon as the scanning has finished, then we can start annotating the data. Because if I go ahead and check my data catalog, I could now, for instance, already start querying the information. I could say, oh, do I have information about bikes somewhere in there? Okay, and then the system can say, oh yeah, there's a trip data set, and that has a bike number column in there. Okay, show me more. So if you click upon it, we now see the kinds of information that the automated scan has retrieved. Which schemas, for instance, do we have in there? Which columns were detected? But as you see, on each of these columns, there is no metadata yet, except the name of the column and the data type. If this thing was pulled in via one of the, for instance, pipelines that we made in Synapse, then we could see lineage information. Let me maybe quickly search for one with lineage information. This one, if I'm not mistaken, has lineage information in it. So here I can see, hey, this resource set, this collection of files was produced with this particular pipeline. And you can then click on switch to Synapse Analytics, and there you can see the pipeline, how it was developed. And it got its data from this source over here. So that's the lineage information that it's collecting as well. So in these things, we can just go ahead and consume this data, but if we want, we can also go ahead and start annotating it. So for instance, over here, the system said, hey, in your schema, I found that there were two columns where I guess this is latitude and longitude information, but maybe I have other things as well. Landmark is maybe geographical information. And maybe I have to link this with something that I have in my glossary, etc. So if we start clicking edit, we can go ahead, and if we have the permissions, of course, we can start making all sorts of annotations on top of this. For instance, station data. What kind of data is this? List of bike locations, if you're a bike rental company, for instance, etc., etc. So you can go ahead and start typing things. You can go ahead and label this as one of these classes that we had seen before. And you can, in a self-service scenario, you can say, oh, this is a certified data set. IT has spent enough time in purifying this data, so you can go ahead and build your own reports on top of this, and we have trust in the data set as being pure enough. Or for instance, at the schema level, you can say, oh, landmark, yeah, well, that really is some country information. So let's go ahead and search. This is a country or region. So I'm going to mark these things myself, and I'm going to have some extra description, and then again, some explanation where this information comes from, or for instance, country names in English. So whatever kind of metadata is useful, you can store it in here. If the lineage is more advanced than this one, for instance, if you go like, yeah, this source over here even gets further information, you can manually add lineage information to this, else you just live with whatever the system could detect for you. Or you could, for instance, say, hey, if you ever have questions on this data set, oh, I know Nico is a real expert on this data set. He's, I don't know what, the bike manager. So go ahead and ask him if you have further questions. So that's the annotation phase, where people, typically business people, go in, see what kind of metadata has been scanned, and enrich the data. If data is the new gold, yeah, sometimes you have to polish up your gold. That's more or less what we're doing over here. Okay, once all of this has been done, then of course the business people can now really start using this. So for instance, I didn't have enough time to talk about glossaries, but we can go ahead and set up glossaries. So in glossaries, we can define all sorts of business terms. For instance, over here, I have introduced a few simple business terms. We have students, but students are a special type of customers. We have hierarchies within your glossary. And here as well, we can then go ahead and see like, hey, did we label anything of that? So you can now click on customer and then see all the items that were labeled with this glossary term, or again, the other way around, go to a term, label things that way. Okay, so with this kind of approach, we set up these scans, but once the scan has been set up, we can go ahead and query the data. I don't have enough time to talk about Key Vault. That's the authentication information. How can Purview talk to your databases, to your files, etc. Azure Key Vault can help you out with that one. So we have already seen we can choose the scope of the scan. Do we scan everything? Do we scan a subset of the data? The rule sets where you can go ahead and choose which kind of patterns you're looking for. Here a screenshot of how you can add your own type of classification rules. But again, we're a bit short in time to go into all those kind of details, but there is extensive documentation on all of that. So check out learn.microsoft.com under Purview. But here, for instance, this screenshot shows how we add a booking code, a YouTube booking code. So you can write, for instance, a regular expression pattern over here, and then have some thresholds. How much % of the data needs to meet that pattern before you label it of that particular classification type. Okay, I talked very briefly about glossaries, so super important that you all speak the same term. What is a customer? Sometimes there's a lot of debate inside a company what exactly is considered a customer, etc. So glossaries should end those kind of debates, and then you can link this information. Okay, since we don't have that much time left, I already showed you that you can then search your collection. That's pretty straightforward. But what we can do as well is we can go ahead and make sure that we can get a sort of report that explains what kind of data that we have. So instead of just browsing these things, we have another page called the Purview Data Estate. And with the Purview Data Estate, we can go ahead and get a list, for instance, of how many files do you have in blob storage versus inside databases, how many of these things have GDPR related information in there or have passwords in there or whatever. So sort of bird's eye view on top of your data with a bunch of predefined reports that allow you to drill down into the data, not bottom up, but top down. Okay, I already showed you how it integrates, for instance, with Synapse Analytics. So that's all the browsing part. Now, if we want to go ahead and make sure we can talk to Purview from, for instance, scripts, or that we can integrate it in our own applications, there is an API for that as well. And there are a lot of ways to interact with it. Over here, for instance, I have an example of a PowerShell commandlet. So with this PowerShell commandlet, I can connect to my Purview account. And then, for instance, I can go ahead and tell it, oh, let's show me a GUI. So these are all the methods that you have available in your API to get information. So for instance, I could go ahead and say, oh, I want to, from my glossary, I want to go ahead and read my glossary terms. So then I can go ahead, click on that one, click OK, and it's calling now a REST service, and that REST service returns all the items I have in the glossary. So that's, for instance, a convenient way if you want to move data from, for instance, a development to a test environment. You can program something like this, like a PowerShell commandlet, to export the data from one and then import it into another. Okay, so that's how we can integrate Purview in our own applications if we want. So REST API, here you have a link. Since there are recordings, you can later on come back to this and take a look at the link. And that one, for instance, has a Swagger file such that your developers can easily start building .NET, Python, or whatever kinds of applications on top of this. So I showed you that there's, for instance, a PowerShell package out there, but you also have, for instance, a command line interface. If you're more into that, you could, for instance, tell the system to go to Purview, PV, and then it will go ahead and show you what you can do. On Purview, I want to go to my glossaries. And then it can go ahead and list, for instance, all the glossaries or create a new glossary entry, etc. via code. So not only a tool for the business people to use, also developers and administrators can start developing code on top of this. Okay, to finish up, a few new features that I haven't shown you yet, but that were recently added to the product. Some of them are still in preview. One thing is data share. Sometimes companies need to share data with, for instance, consultancy teams, etc. And in the past, you could configure that in Azure, but now Purview allows you, from within the Purview portal, to specify that some of the data that you have in your catalog over there should be shared with other teams or with external users via an Azure data share. Another interesting one is, in companies, sometimes people search the catalog, find an interesting resource, like an interesting table, and then if they try to read it, they get the message that they don't have permissions on top of this. So one thing that Microsoft is adding on top of this is that you can now go and via Purview grant people permissions to read your data, either by hand or even with some sort of workflow where they go ahead, make a request, then a workflow kicks in and asks for confirmation from a manager to approve this access. What they also are adding is the option to store business assets in there, that you can store information like, hey, these are our products. These are, for instance, the different countries where we're active. So they're defining business assets. And then again, you can label your sources with some of those business assets. We also saw that out of the box, every resource that you register has a bunch of attributes. For instance, the classification, the glossary terms, etc. But we can go ahead and also define new attributes ourselves in the new version. So if you have a company-specific attribute that is needed, like a SQL code or whatever that you want to assign to things, you can go ahead and add your own custom attributes. So to wrap up this talk, we saw that Microsoft Purview is a tool that can collect metadata from both on-premises and cloud data. We first have to register where the metadata lives, and then we have to set up a manual or an automatic scan, and it will go ahead and pull in that metadata. If we want, we can manually enrich it. Again, if data is the new gold, we have to polish it from time to time. But then, of course, the main goal of all this effort is that people in your company can start querying the data. With the new features that they are adding and that are being improved, you will also be able to, for instance, grant permissions on this data or share the data with external partners, etc. So that were the things that I wanted to explain to you, and maybe this is a good time to see whether questions came in from the audience.
Nico, for a great presentation and for a great hour of learning all about data governance in Microsoft Purview. So we will get straight into the question and answers part. So should you wish to ask a question, please feel free to type it into the questions window now. So we just have a question in here, and someone is asking, what if my source is not in the list of available sources?
Yeah, so we saw out of the box you have a bunch of predetermined sources, and that list cannot manually be enriched. So you cannot go ahead and say, oh, I'm writing some C# code, and then we have an extra source that shows up in the list. Only Microsoft can do that. But what we can do is we saw these APIs at the end. And with the APIs, you can push information, yeah, more or less whatever you want. So if you have a source that is not in the list, you can still push the metadata, but you'll have to use the API and write a bit of code or PowerShell to achieve this.
Brilliant, thanks Nico. And just another question then, can we migrate Purview data from one tenant to another?
Yeah, so in the portal, if you would go to the manage, you will see there is no single backup button where you can say, oh, we'll back up everything that we have in here, and then we'll get a file and we'll restore that one elsewhere. So it's not like a SQL Server database where you can easily take a backup in one spot and restore it on the other spot. But here again, the APIs can come to the rescue, because we saw with the APIs, we can, for instance, get the glossary terms, we can go ahead and get all the collections that we defined, etc. But not only we can retrieve them via the code, we can also create them via these APIs. So the job would be to go ahead and first write a script to extract them from, for instance, tenant 1, and then with a second script, push them into tenant 2. There you have to be a bit careful, because for most of the APIs, they don't allow to return more than 100,000 items. So yeah, if you have more than 100,000 items, yeah, it becomes challenging to move them from one location to another. So that's currently a limitation we have to live with.
Brilliant. Thanks again, Nico. So that seems to be all the questions for today. So just on behalf of the ESPC community, we want to extend a huge thank you again to you, Nico, for taking the time today to carry out this webinar. We really do appreciate it.
It was my pleasure. Thank you.
So I just see another question has come in there. Someone is asking, you might follow up with an evaluation form, but I wanted to make sure to thank you for this outstanding presentation. So he says it's rare to find webinars of such great quality. Much appreciated. So again, thanks, Nico.
Thank you.
So that is the end of today's webinar. You can find this webinar and more at sharepointeurope.com/resource center. So thanks again to all of you for joining us today. So that's it for today, folks. Take care, and we hope to see you again for more learning.